Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay in the back? All right, great. Welcome, everyone. I'm Heidi Minzner. I'm a solutions architect for Dynamics 365 for operations. And I have my colleagues here with me, Sagita and Kishore. And welcome to the session on performance testing and validation experiences. So for today's session, what we're going to cover is the different aspects of the implementation project and things you should be considering in each phase of the implementation project from a performance point of view. We'll also take a look at some samples and some best practices on documentation of performance scenarios and tracking your performance goals and objectives. And then Kishore will spend some time actually going through some of the tooling that we have available to support you in that performance testing efforts. So from a performance point of view, really the point in which we should start thinking about performance goals, and what we are looking to achieve through our performance testing and validation should start in the very beginning of the project in your analysis phase. And part of that is defining, what are the goals, not only from a business process perspective or response time point of view, but also from just a measurable success for some of your perhaps batch processing and so on. So it's not always just about how fast is the UI responding from a user point of view, but can you also achieve your integrations or batch processes that you have ongoing in the system in the time that it's acceptable or within that batch window. Also, once your performance objectives and your scenarios are documented, and we'll go through, like I said, in more detail, as you move into the design and develop phase, you should have those performance objectives and goals in mind, so you're designing and developing systems that will meet or exceed those performance goals. Then we move into the testing phase, and this is where we'll spend some time going through some of the tooling we have available to help with the testing and the creation of the tests. And then, of course, that testing process might be iterative, so you might go through that testing, identify some areas that need some tuning, and then go through a retest exercise. And then, of course, as you go live, the continuous monitoring and maintenance of the system. And, of course, there's tools from an environment monitoring point of view that can help you in regards to not only for us internally at Microsoft for monitoring, but also for you as customers and partners to monitor the performance of the system. So we'll go into each of these areas in a little bit more detail. So from a performance objective point of view, it's really important to identify what the critical scenarios are. So this is obviously going to be based on the type of organization, the industry, what are those critical processes that we need to ensure we're seeing the system response that we would expect so that business is not impeded by the process. And defining the goals around those critical scenarios as well. And like I previously mentioned, some of those are response time related. How reactive is it from a user entering, like a sales order, for instance, versus what are those processes that we just want to measure and track the timing so that we can ensure that we can complete those processes within the time window that we have available for those processes to complete. And important throughout the entire process is to document and communicate what those critical scenarios are, what are the goals that the business has related to those scenarios, and then communicate those, get agreement on those, and then after the performance testing, of course, is reporting back the results, and so that there's no surprises along the way. Dan? And of course, as part of the documenting the scenarios, we'll want to take a look at defining the load profile. And what this really means is How many different processes are we going to have running in the system concurrently? As an example, and I come from finance, so I'll use my a month-end processing example. During month-end, when your finance team is trying to close the books, do financial reporting, you still have everyday business activities going on in the system. So that might be an example of, what does that load profile look like for a process like month-end closing? You still have people in the system processing orders, producing checks. And in addition, in those times of the month, you might have more frequent balance updates, financial reports running. So some of those are, defining that load profile and how many concurrent users will be in the system, what activities are going on at the same time, so that when you're testing those critical scenarios, it is, it matches the needs of the organization and what's expected usage of the system. As far as the scenario characteristics, this would be when you're defining, and this goes into the second point too, of the data volumes. It's not just about the volume of data that you're testing with from a performance point of view, but it's also the proliferation of data. So for instance, if we go back to that sales order example, you might load the system from a starting point with sales orders that have 100 lines, and what's the percentage of sales orders that come in with 100 lines versus 50 lines versus 25 lines, and have some proliferation of that data to mimic a real-world scenario from a customer point of view. And so defining all of this information up front and what that's going to look like, what are the transactions that will be part of the test, what is the load profile, what are the acting users doing in the system simultaneously, and then communicating these scenarios ahead of the testing in the design phase of the project, so that everyone understands and can contribute to what those critical scenarios are and what the expected results are. What does the data volume look like? One of the tools that some of you might already be familiar with that can help you in the beginning of the process to identify some of these volumes is the subscription estimator in LCS. It's not only used to help us, determine the sizing from a production environment point of view, but it can also be used to help you in the analysis phase of the project. And in fact, it's a task that shows up in the analysis phase in lifecycle services for you to determine what are my master data volumes, what's my peak load from a transaction point of view per hour. And that's an important metric to capture, because as we go through the performance testing and validation, we do want to test for those peak scenarios of what's the highest volume that we would expect in, say, an hourly basis, just as an example. So you can use that tool as a benefit in the beginning of the project. You can update that subscription estimate as you're going through the project as well. So just because you have one loaded and active doesn't mean you can't make changes to it. You certainly can. But that's a good way to capture that information through the analysis phase. So now Sagita's going to walk through just an example of the defining the scenarios and the performance objectives through a couple of tools or samples that we have put together, just to provide some context to the discussion on the slides.
Okay, yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Heidi mentioned, the best way to learn and understand what we are speaking about from the theoretical perspective is just through example. At least that's the way how I do learn. Before we move into that example, I wanted to highlight a couple of things that Heidi had talked in the slides. So first of all, as we often see in the projects mistake that is being made, that performance testing is being left as something as an afterthought to the end of the close to the go-live date around the testing phase, where sometimes it's already too late to make some of the adjustments that would make those experiences way better. And at the same time, implementation team members and stakeholders, they don't have a common understanding and agreement what actually are those goals that will help me to say, yes, my system is performing as the way I was expecting it to be performing, and my implementation this way is successful. So for that, it's really important to start performance testing activities, performance-related activities in the analysis phase. And it is not technical, not only technical task, as a lot of people are thinking. Oh, yeah, performance testing, I don't know. I don't know anything about it. I don't want to care about it. So really, functional people should be involved in the beginning of the project and should be defining those performance-related scenarios and together with business users, defining acceptable performance goals. So example that I have, what we are going to walk through here is it is just, let's say we have a customer and sales and distribution, right? And you will see that different patterns and different sensitive activities that performance-wise in different industries that you need to account for. And working in an industry and doing a couple of customers, you definitely know what things you need to consider if you are working, let's say, with manufacturing customer, the service industry customer, the sales and distribution, retail. So definitely there are different aspects to that. So let's take as an example just sales and distribution customer. So let's say in the beginning of implementation, somewhere where I already know and understand the scope of the project, what we are going to implement, but obviously before we even start any design activities, I need to sit down with the key members of the implementation team, the key owners of the business processes, and discuss what are those critical scenarios that we need to include into our performance testing. What are the things that we need to have as a part of our performance testing? So with sales and distribution, there are very, very straightforward examples. So let's say what's important in sales and distributions? Definitely sales orders, sales documents, right? So during the day, likely there'll be a lot of sales representatives who are in the system and they are keying in the data, either manually or the data is flowing from some external systems. That also adds to the volume. And if we delay creation of the sales order while customer is on the line, that means, likely lost money because that customer either will drop off or will not come and will not buy from me another time. So definitely those are sensitive places where we want to make sure that our performance is acceptable from the perspective that it is comfortable for the end user, it is allowing to achieve the business goal, and it is allowing to complete the task on time. So as I said, peak hour data entry, like sales orders or sales quotations, sales agreements, that would be one example, a group of important scenarios for that customer. Another example of scenarios would be shipment, okay? So we have made the sale, we have created the sales order. The goods afterwards need to leave the warehouse. How those goods are leaving the warehouse? Let's say the trucks that are coming and are taking those goods. And to take those goods, they need to have packing slips printed. So again, example from the customer day of life. So let's say trucks are coming in waves, and they are coming, let's say, 3 times in a day. And for each of those waves, there are X number of trucks that typically comes in, and they need to be dispatched in 15 minutes. So that's, again, very sensible and very clear performance goals that we need to make sure that we can print all the packing slips for that volume of trucks that are coming in one wave in 15 minutes. That's another good example. Definitely examples like, let's say, replenishment, okay? So let's say people who are planning the purchasing of inventory, doing MRP, they are coming in. And so question is how that process is happening and how customer expects that process to happen, right? There might be that in some companies it is just being done, on the nightly basis, and that's automated process. In other companies, there are a number of people who are coming in the beginning of the day. Oops. Okay, that's a train. Sorry about that. So yeah, the number of people coming in the beginning of the day, and they are running that MRP process, and they're planning their replenishment. So again, you need to account to that, and you need to account to that in the mix of those sales orders that also cannot be delayed, and everything is happening in the same system. Integration with external systems. Let's say you need to provide your customer the pricing lists every month, right? So to provide the pricing, you need also to calculate the prices. And sometimes those calculations can get really crazy, complicated and expensive to run. So again, so that is not probably the day day procedure. That sounds like a periodic procedure that you are doing. But again, you are expecting a volume, or you are expecting highly consuming process that is going to be run, and you need to account and you need to plan for that period of time when that process would be running, and you need to measure if you have enough of the time window to run that process during your day in the life. So, as I already have started talking about that, when we are talking about those different scenarios that we consider, let's say we sit with our business users, we list those scenarios that are important, and as discussed, that would be either time-sensitive scenarios, where you really need to get into the, get the data, get good response time, and or either it could be, let's say, batch run scenarios, where we just need to ensure that the volume that we're expecting, we can handle it, and we have enough of the time window in the end of the day to handle everything as we need. So once we get the list of scenarios, we get the goals, and in a couple of minutes I will show you a specific example how you could track that. You would have to group those scenarios into two buckets. So one bucket would be the processes that you would expect to run during your peak hour, and another bucket would be the processes that you potentially will run during night. So that would be like batch processes that you would be running. For the first set of processes, what's important about that you need to measure response for those processes. In the example that we just discussed, we discussed that sales orders will be run during the day. Shipments would be run during the day. Let's say customer invoicing maybe will be processed during the day as well because it's important. And let's say the price calculations, vendor invoicing, some other tasks might be running during the night. So you would be putting that into a separate bucket that would be running during the night. So separate that out. What does it mean? For the first set of scenarios, you will need to make sure, after you develop each individual scenario, you will need to make sure and you will need to plan the phase where you run those scenarios simultaneously to simulate the load and understand how system behaves with that load. In the other set of scenarios, you would measure the goal. So it would mean that you can run those processes individually. You just would need to measure how long does it take to process the volume that you are expecting as per scenario. And afterwards, you will need to calculate based on the windows that you have where you can run those periodic processes, if you have enough time for that or not, or if you need to go to do some optimizations. So that would be from the very, very high level. So with that, I will just go and I will get and show you some simple examples. So definitely it is not, don't take it as, as a written in blood template that everybody has to use exactly that way. I'm sure that, people in projects do have the way how they document the things. Important part is to document it as I said, in the beginning of the implementation project, and to make sure that all the responsible parties are aware of those scenarios that are critical from the performance perspective, and are aware of the goals that needs to be matched for those scenarios. So I have a simple Excel table here as an example, and I will just go through a couple of lines how we could document those scenarios. And you will, definitely you will have your own, and you will have your own templates how you do it. The good idea is to have that working spreadsheet, work on it, get help from your business users to fill in and agree, of the right set of scenarios, and put and document it as a part of your functional requirements document, to make sure that everybody is following, understand what those scenarios are, and are developing and testing to meet those goals. So in this Excel file, the table that I have and what I'm tracking which scenarios that from the listed ones are at part of the day peak hour. Remember those two buckets that I've been talking about, where we have things that we run during day time and things that we can just test individually and just measure the goal instead of response time. And I have obviously scenario name. I need to have description of the scenario just for people to understand, because some descriptions might be vague. So I'm just describing what that scenario would be if I have some additional information. I need to have a time frame for scenario. So it means I need to understand when that scenario is supposed to run. And I need to have also expected data volume for that scenario. And I need to have performance goal. And the last thing that I need to have, and we will talk about that in the end, I need to have a list of task recordings that I'm going to produce to document that scenario that I'm talking about. So let's say, very simple example in the beginning, users logging in. In a typical implementation, you probably even wouldn't be testing that, right? Because we get that information to let's say, to product team, and DSC team does know you're looking at subscription estimator, what's the set of your users, they provide you the hardware that you will be logging in. But still, there might be the situations where you have a large volume of number of users that are logging into the system. And those users, let's say you know that they are going to log in a very, very short time window. Let's say you have thousands of users that are going to be logging in half an hour. You still might be curious, and you might want to know and make sure that all of those users are able to get into the system into that period of time. So let's say I can have like scenario description that I say, I expect that there will be 1,000 of users that, will be logging into the system over the 30 minutes of time, and because they are just coming to work and everybody just opens the system at the same time, and they will be opening multiple browser windows because they are working with different forms and will be doing things in there. So that would be the example of scenario that I would have. So the time frame for that would be obviously that it is 30 minutes, and it is typically what we expect between 7 and 7:30 a.m., which is sometimes a good information to know, especially if we are planning the window when the batch processes are finishing. And for data volume, again, it's pretty obvious here that it is 1,000 users, and each user opens 4 browser tabs in parallel. This is, again, kind of descriptive. For performance goal, as we obviously want them to be successful with logging in, we want to make sure that they don't need to hang and wait for a long time. Let's say the performance goal that in 5 seconds, each of those users is able to log in. So that's just one example. Another example would be that peak hour sales order entry. So again, let's say in sales and distributions, it is a big thing. There is a large number of users who are, creating those sales orders, let's say manually, and they're taking them over the phone or with any different means. And there are also other ways how those sales orders are getting into the system. Let's say they are being imported from some, integrations, flowing in from some web app where, customer can place their own order and they are getting imported and so on. So let's say the high-level description that there are different types of the sales orders that we need to be able to enter and run. And typically the peak for entering those sales orders, we know that it is 1 hour, and it is happening usually Monday morning at 8 a.m., right? It is an example. And if you will manage and test for the peak hour, then you will be confident that your system is able to run on non-peak hour as well. Okay, for the data volume, it gets a little bit complicated here, and we want to get as much preciseness in the data volume as we can, and we want to understand a little bit better the data composition. In that case, we are expecting high volumes of data. So in this example, I do know that people typically enter, let's say, 10,000 lines per hour manually, and the typical sales order varies. Most of them are just one line. There's, like a little bit of them that are up to 10 lines, and like 10% that might get to the large number of lines, right? So I could get that composition. Okay, people sometimes ask me, okay, how the heck I can know that? I don't know. I'm talking to my customer. They're not going to give me good numbers for that. There are different ways how you can mine the data. So there are existing systems probably that they are moving to when you are implementing, because they are handling those volumes. They are not doing that manually anyways. So existing systems, you can get the data from there. You can get developers' help to mine the data and to see historical transactions and see what was the time window and what was the pattern of those transactions. But important thing is that you provide as much information as you can for developer in those sensitive scenarios that developer can know, and they can design the processes that, and let's say extensions that they would put on sales orders the way that it would account that, let's say, majority of those manually entered will be with low volume, and there will be just few which will be high volume. Because there are some certain decisions that you are making in code that highly depend on those type of things. Okay? So again, you are setting performance goal, and again, that performance goal could be both ability to handle all the volume that you define in a specific time window, and for manual entry, what would be response time that you would expect that user is going to get. And let's say in this example, I'm listing a set of task recordings that I expect to produce as a result of my performance goal setting, which will document how do I expect those scenarios are going to work. Because technical people, they obviously, they potentially know a lot about the system, but sometimes they don't, and you really don't want to be vague and just describe in high level sentences how the process is going to look like. The best way to document that is using the task recording. How many of you are familiar with task recordings? Okay, the majority is, so we don't need to go deeper in that. This is an absolutely awesome tool that is highly recommended and can be used in performance testing in a very successful way, and Kishore is going to talk about that as well. So, and the third line that I have, I already covered that probably a little bit in the slides. So the third example of shipping goods, where we need to print those packing slips. And let's say, again, business-driven requirements, we know the loads that are typically coming into our warehouses. We can define that. And we know the typical, that according to the business rules, we have just 15 minutes time window to dispatch those trucks, and all the printing needs to happen in that period of time. So those are just a couple of examples that I have just to get you thinking once you are getting into analysis phase and once you are thinking about what you expect from the system performance-wise. First of all, make sure that you do that activity, and second of all, make sure that you list those scenarios in any way. Be very precise and clear about the goals that you set, and be also clear about the data volumes and about the timeframes. Another thing that I wanted to show you before we move on to the more technical part, and Kishore is going to show how to do that testing after you have planned it, is another thing that functional person should help technical person and should provide during the implementation as a big to do successful performance testing. So when we are running performance tests, there is a high difference if we will run those performance tests on empty database just with configurations, and you might get completely different and unpredictable results if you will run it on a more realistic data composition, right? So what is the good thing to provide for technical people who are designing and afterwards will be running performance tests is the expected data composition, at least on a very, very high level. We ask for that mandatory in any project and the subscription estimator, right? So very high level, we already providing those things in LCS, and every implementation project has to define, what is the peak hour of your, let's say, sales orders, peak hour of different types of transactions, and so on. So high level, we ask for that mandatory. It's a good idea to think about that and to provide some more detailed information around it. And again, just a little example that I have in the same spreadsheet. There might be a difference, again, when we are talking about what I have right now and what I'm expecting to have in my system, let's say in a couple of months or in a year, and I want to make sure that my system is performance for those goals. So essentially, I would like to have two sets of numbers. I would like to set the numbers for the situation as it is today, and I would like to have the set of numbers how I would imagine that situation is going to grow over the time. So definitely we want to know the number of legal entities, and there is high difference when you are running performance tests if whatever you model it is, on one legal entity, and you just test that in one and you think, okay, I'm good. But as soon as you get 100 legal entities, which is definitely the case in some implementations that we have, your performance, again, results might be completely different. So you want to understand how many legal entities you are going to have. You want to understand your master data and at least main things that you have there. The set of users, both as you have today, as you expect to grow over the medium period of time. And you potentially want to have a distribution of those users, and you want to understand, like in this specific example, we are slicing and seeing both for situation today and the target situation. What of those legal entities are large? It means a lot of users are logging in there. What of those legal entities are medium? What of those are small? And what potential numbers do we expect per each of the legal entities? So this type of information, this is an example. There might be different slicing that might be interesting and important to understand. So make sure that during analysis phase, you also talk to those technical people once you know some of that situation and you agree what additional information should be put together to make sure that we have a good framework to our performance testing. And as I mentioned, obviously get the list of those task guides, record them, and hand them over to the technical person, as Kishore is, to whom I'm going to hand over right now the presentation, and he's going to show what he would do with those task guides after he knows those performance goals and what he's doing to do further with that. So we've been going through sales and distribution, little example. So we will just, let's say I have recorded the task recording for manual entry of the sales order, and Kishore is going to talk a little bit more how he can leverage that to create the automated test and test the performance for this. Do you want to switch right now?
So now that you have all the data related to your functional key scenarios and the data characteristics, it's before even you start the development, it is good to have all these things documented and communicated with your developer. And the development team should also have access to the realistic data compositions that will help them test in the way you expect the end users to use the system. So this gives us a benefit that we are not going to have any surprises when we are at the final stages. We want to test for performance, and that's when you will think about, okay, let me create a data composition that is more realistic. But by then it might be too late to fix any underlying problems if they are big. So during the development, it's always a good idea to have this goals set for every scenario and every at least the key scenarios, because that helps the developers to consider that as a requirement instead of that being handled as an afterthought during performance test. So the way we expect, or at least the way we do it internally within Microsoft, is using trace parser. And since it's going to be a single box setup for all the devs, going through the task recording or just playing that functionality again and again during the development phase to see if the trend is positive and we are meeting the goals, at least on a single box. If there's any problem, they can identify the call stacks and identify the sequels that need to be tuned. Sometimes it can also help us identify the settings or configuration that can help us save some cost. For example, if you're taking an example of retail statements posting, just hold on. I think there's no power in this. No. Okay, good. Maybe a false message. Okay. So I was talking about traces. So the traces, the example that I was talking about is the retail performance. There is an option there which helps you aggregate. The end result is going to be slightly different, but functionally it's almost same. So if you're taking an example of grocery store where they sell some items more often than others, for example, milk or vegetables, and a lot of people walk in with as cash payments, right? There's no loyalty or anything. So in this case, it's probably more performant if you want to just summarize everything or aggregate everything and post a single line for milk or vegetables instead of individual sales. This we can find when you're posting on a single dev box and see if that configuration can be enabled to save some cost. Other tools that we could use there is the performance timer. I will show all of these tools a little bit down the line. What this gives is like you are running a manual test and you see that there is performance issue. All you need to do is pass on a parameter called debug equal to developer, and that gives you more details on what's really going on, where the time is being spent, and even the call stacks. I don't think it's working. I'm getting a low battery warning here. Let me turn this. Okay, much better. So there are various aspects. What I see is that some customers are focused on only integration, some customers are focused on only batch performance, some customers are only focused on online user or interactive operations. But it's good to have a complete profile of all the key operations, including reports and integrations and batch. This gives us a profile that can be used later on to see which part of those are critical for me to validate during the performance validation phase. So we are at a stage where the development is done, assuming that the developers have taken care of handling the performance goals as a feature or functional requirement or non-functional requirement and address it. During the testing phase, you can reuse a lot of those components or the task guides, for example, that you have to convert them into a day in the life, a scenario where multiple scenarios run together and make a particular activity or represent a particular activity within a critical or peak hour of the business. So it's a good idea to think about how all of this will come together in the test. There are some challenges. For example, if you are working on some complex scenarios where the data is being passed between different divisions or different users, it gets quite tricky because you are just creating a record using a virtual user or using a test, and you want to pass the same record to another test which is running on the same environment, but how do we transfer this record to them? How do we say that, okay, this document is at this phase, you want to take it to the next level? There are some ideas how you can address those, but you have to think about this in the beginning, because these things could mean that you may want to add in like simple code in your system, like when you are creating a sales order, you may want to add that sales order ID that you want to pass on to the next user to continue the processing. Or you can have like a simple interface, OData or anything that can give me the next document that I have to process. So once you have this design ready, the next step is to actual creation of scripts. And for that, if you've seen a tool called Perf SDK, it's kind of tricky to use, or I would say it is easy to use but tricky to set up. But let's assume that it is in a working condition. All you have to do is take these task recordings and just import them, and they get converted into working scripts. Of course, they are they have hard-coded values, and they have hard-coded, not hard-coded, I would say, very static flows. For example, if the recording was to create a sales order with 5 lines, every time you run that test, it's going to create only 5 lines. But if you can peep into the code and see there is a pattern between every line that you create. If you want to change it to add a functionality where line numbers vary, or if you want to pick different customer, or if you want to change the item IDs, or if you have very complex requirement where you want to handle, let's say, 80% of my sales come from 10% of my items, and 10% of my sales come from 30% of my items. This kind of behavior can be implemented if you just look at the code and see what part of that code is handling what part of the functionality. Data is also going to be important in a way that if you are working on the customer data set, it could have very random patterns in it. Or if you want to have a synthetic data, you have complete control over it. So it's easy for you to determine how my or the master items look like, or what kind of series belong to a master item versus something with the variants, or what series of items belong to my hot items that we sell more often. All this is in your control, so you can actually use different patterns for these items or for these the IDs of those items to help you later on during the automatic picking of the input to achieve whatever functionality or whatever distribution that you want to achieve when you run the test. Other things that you want to consider when you are looking at the scenario is how many documents are created in an hour by a user. Sometimes these things are very fast. Like, for example, if you are looking at a call center setup, they want to quickly be done with you and move on to the next customer. So their rate of entry is much faster than someone who is doing it leisurely at a work environment. Other things I can think of are like if your end users are at remote locations with a very limited internet connectivity, you want to see how much bandwidth do they have, what kind of latencies from the client, from the browser to the server. How do we simulate that? How do we represent that in the test so that we can finally, at the end when we get the result, we will know what kind of experiences will those users have. So once you have all of this ready, the next step is to deploy your scripts, your application, so that you can run a performance simulation test. Now, there is a sandbox, there are multiple sandbox environments that you can pick from, and that list is going to grow. But basically, we will help you out if you have your usage profile ready. We will help you out with that choice. And in fact, these results will help us even during the deployment of your production environment, because we have characteristics that help us, or that is at least representative of your production usage on a sandbox environment. And sandbox is almost like production, just in a slightly smaller scale. So using these results, we can actually determine what kind of experiences will you have, how to make it better, if there's any problem. Sometimes if there are issues, we can have conversation to understand what really is causing that problem, if it is on the service side or if it is on the app side. So when you are executing the tests, I always start slowly, step by step. I increase the complexity. I start with one scenario, start with one user, gradually increase by tuning all the low-hanging fruits, and then add more and more scenarios and go up. That way, we are not, if there is any problem, it becomes more difficult for us to track back and see what exactly could be causing that problem. This, in my experience, has been the best or the shortest route to finding all the issues. Tuning, there are certain options. If the developers were aware of the non-functional requirements, you will spend less time here. But if it is an afterthought, this can result in a lot of rework, and that can derail your project schedule. So that's the reason why we stress that even when there is no need for performance test, or you should not just decide that, you should just note down the profile, you should just fill in the usage profile and see what could potentially become a risk. Obviously, reporting is an optional thing because it's a cloud service. You may not all of this information is relevant. For example, resource utilization. But if you have this documented somewhere, at least it's not going to be an exercise of reinventing the wheel if you see a problem later on. Moving on to the tools. Task Recorder is the first thing you would start using. That's when the functional, PMs will document, record, and share these with the developers. This saves a lot of time in the development cycle because each developer, they're not really functional savvy, so it's easier for them if they have data, if they have a task guide. These two will help them run the tests again and again without having to worry about remembering the functionalities, creating a data configuration to represent the customer situation. There are a couple of tools for that. Data entities is what I would recommend to start with for all your master data entities. It's much easier if you want to change something in the future, because sometimes the projects can be so huge, especially where you have the need for performance testing. Things change. And if you want to handle these changes, you have data entity files that can be easily changed and uploaded again to the system, which gives you a new up-to-date configuration for developers to revalidate. Data expansion tool is something that was there all the time, but it was never exposed. I see it now. If you have some time, explore it, because it's an awesome tool to explode your database volume, especially for transactions, to any size you want very quickly. Let's say you want to create 6 months worth of historic transactional data. It's just a matter of a week's effort to right from understanding what volumes you want to generate, what transactions that would be, and then to have the data ready in your database. Trace Parser, again, most of you are familiar with it. It gives you call stacks, it gives you the call tree, it gives you it highlights expensive operations. Pretty easy during the development phase, and also if you see any problems during your performance test, you could collect smaller traces, because the sessions are collected on the server. So you like it or not, it's not just your session on the server, and you will get all those sessions, especially if it is a multi-user activity. So the size can get pretty big very soon. So it's easier if you have smaller but multiple traces. That makes it easier for you when you import and analyze it. Query store. This is something in the SQL which I think it was introduced a couple of years ago. It gives you all the expensive queries and what plans were used. There are multiple views and you can slice and dice the data there, and it's pretty easy to track certain queries that you think can become problematic. So I'm not going to go in through all the tools when I'm demoing, but at least I'm providing the references at the end. If you are after you go back, you can go through them and see them look at them for yourself. Visual Studio load testing is the main load generator that we use. This is where we have the code generator too, which converts your task recording into a test that can later be modified to address all your scenario needs. And finally, LCS monitoring. If you are doing this on the sandbox environment, you may not get the health metrics because health is maintained only for the production environments, but diagnostics is available there. If you can see what's happening right now, you can see what's consuming more time. You can look at all those analysis. You can even see expensive queries and where they are coming from right from this. You don't need to collect a trace. You can even look at the monitoring diagnostics. Diagnostics dashboard for that. So with that, I'm going to jump into showing a few of those tools. So I'm not going to show you the task recording and the import part, but once you import the test, basically you import it using an add-in in the Dynamics 365. This is a typical dev box that we deployed from LCS, and on the Dynamics 365 menu add-ins, and you will find this create C# perf testing from a recording. You just have to pick the recording path, the path for that recording that you saved, the project to which, the Visual Studio project to which you want to convert this script, convert that recording into a script and add, and where your main perf SDK folder is. Once you import, you will see a standard, a class with standard methods. Some of these methods they need to be slightly changed. I'll show you what needs to be changed here. One change I have done to get this working is adding this tools.uihelpers.core. Other change I made is this adding this client equal to null and commenting this code. Yeah. How do I do that? Oh, in the here. Any better? And I'm not sure if this was, I think this comes commented out, and this is a section which I added to reset this. I mean, it's not required to run it on a dev box, but when you are running it on a load test environment or a Visual Studio Online, you want to reset this test route to a location where you are running the test. That's the reason why you want to create this. In the future releases, maybe this gets automatically added because there is no harm in having these settings there, having this piece of code there. We will try and make this change as soon as possible. Pretty much that is all I made, the changes I made. The method that is interesting is this setup data. This is where we set up, we have the variables for all the data, custom data that you entered while recording the test. This is a sales order scenario where we opened a form, we entered the customer ID, we added a new line, we entered the item ID and quantity, and we pressed save button. This is the actual test, and if you see here, each of this is a control, a form control or a button control, and there is an action on it. And there are certain, wherever there is a field that you want to set value, you will see a statement like this where, in this case, we are setting customer account value to a cust account field on the form. This is a line creation section. Now, we added some timers here. This is up to you, whether you want these timers or not. What happens when you add timers is it's going to collect, it's going to start a timer and stop a timer between begin and end, and report that in your report, in your final summary page, once the test is complete. By default, you will also get some timers. They are called detail timers. I think it is disabled. The top section which does that is this. What that shows is every request that is going from the client to server is automatically tracked for the response time. Now that gets too overwhelming if you are running like 10 different scenarios. Because there could be hundreds or even up to 1,000 requests when a lot of users are running, a bunch of scenarios. Now, if you want, you can enable it for your individual testing, because individual scenario testing, because it gives you some information on which requests exactly are slow. In this case, it's bundling bunch of request time just to give more, meaningful number to a functional, or mapping to a functional operation on the UI. If you remove this, then it's all Greek and Latin, difficult to understand what request it is, but still, it at least tells you whether in a typical 1 hour of operation, what percentage of user requests are running slow. For example, in our test, we have seen that hardly less than 1% of the operations are slower than 1 second. Rest of them are almost like 0.2 seconds. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So when you run this, do you have to manually add the latency to mimic an actual user action? Because if you run this in an automated setting, it probably will zoom through the test case.
Right.
Not quite like a human interface. Right?
Yeah.
Like a human action. So did you have to add those latency periods manually, or does the tool take care of that?
So the question is, this is an automated generated code. Obviously, it's going to run without any pause, but the users don't do that. Users are slow. Did we do anything in this code to delay that or introduce that delay? So the answer to that is no, but it is definitely needed. And the way you have to do that is, remember I was talking about how many you want to know, and you're recording the scenario, you want to know what document and how many users do it, and what is the number of documents that a user creates in an hour. Now, with that information, you can say that, you want, it could be like, let's say users are creating sales orders. In a typical sales order scenario, call center scenario, there is no gap between individual operation. But if it is something where you are doing your math on the table and then entering the data there, you have it's going to be slightly slower. So depending on that, you want to add more time or less time. Another thing I always try is, let's say you have a large scenario where you are creating a document, you are also posting, but several layers of posting with different users. Now, if it is not very secure, or if security policies are not very complex, you could even decide to create a single test, because it's going to save a lot of time in transferring, in identifying how do we transfer the document ID from one user to another user. Instead, I can just decide to create one large test, do everything in that. In such a case, I can introduce more time between those postings to simulate a large wait between the document being transformed from a new draft document to something that is posted. So the way we introduce what we call as think time is by adding sleep inside these methods. Now, those sleep methods, if you are going to put them within the timers that you have, you will see wrong results, or at least not so accurate results, because the time is inclusive of all the wait time, which could be random. And never try a constant value, always generate a random value between 1 and 20 seconds or whatever works for you. So that's this. The script, and you can expand it. We have several projects which have like 20 and even more scenarios doing all these complex variances to simulate a real scenario. There are a few other things that you have to do. They're all documented in this blog, Perf 103. It is slightly outdated because I see in update 4 they made some changes in the SDK. So the screenshots might look slightly different, but the overall steps remain same. Basically, you are creating a recording, you are generating a script from an XML task recording guide. Then you're downloading a driver for your web load driver. Then you are creating your own certificate, because when you want to, it's fine on a dev box, but when you want to take this to a multi-box environment, you want to have that trust between these two environments. So on a sandbox environment, you have to install this certificate on all the AOS boxes, so that the load generated from the load test, Visual Studio load test tool is actually understood by authorized by the AOS. You will enter the URL of your client, and you will mention the user ID, which is the admin user ID. And if you're running a multi-user test, you will also tell what kind of test users you have in your system. Now, you don't need to have the test users in your AD, but you just have to have this test users in your AX system. Now, there is a tool that comes along with it. It's called ms.dynamics.create users. Once all this is configured, you should be able to run that tool to create how many ever users you want in AX system. Now, the same pattern can be used in this section here in the config file. But one thing you need to remember is that the names should always be with a prefix and a number at the end. And whatever you provide here, it will be used by the tool, the user creation tool as well, to create those users. Yes?
Are there any canned scripts that mimic standard business processes that, like, say, for example, a client is brand new to AX. They have no idea what the process looks like to begin with, but they still want to be able to test for performance.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of having to walk through manually the entire creation of the script, go through task recorder and import it and whatnot,
Yeah.
can you imagine a situation where there are some canned business processes that already have ready-made scripts or XML files that they could just import and start
Yeah. The question is, do we have any canned scenarios for performance testing right out of the box? I'd say the answer is yes. Once you download the performance, the dev box, you should be able to see this perf SDK folder in the service volume, and under that the perf SDK local directory, which has a few of the scenarios, projects which we internally use to test. But these were from update 3. I'm not sure if they work on update 4, but they can be easily tuned or fixed up to run on update 4.
So to add to Kishore's point, we do have standard task guides. Don't forget about that as well. So in LCS project, in business process library, we do already have recorded task guides. So we can look at the business process. We can record not every business process has task guide associated, but a lot of them have. So we can just grab that task guide and use this as a starting point as well.
Is that directly translated to like a script as shown like in the demo?
You would have, so it will be just the task guide, task recording file that you would have to import, as Kishore was showing, and you would. Yes, yes, exactly. But you don't need to create it on your own if you don't want it for the very beginning. But still, I would probably highly recommend to create it as you go along the way on the configuration and the specific environment that customer is going to use.
Yeah.
That small code modification
Uh-huh. I'll try to put that on the presentation, so when you download it, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so it depends on the scenario. The question is, can we run any script multiple times? For example, if you're creating a customer, and if that is a test where you hard-coded values, obviously you cannot run it more than once because the customer is already created unless you refresh the database. But there are things that you could do in such cases. Obviously, that customer creation is a bad example, but if you think of an example where you're doing item arrival, you need to have a purchase order in a state where item arrival can pick up and process it. Now, once you do that, you cannot use it again. So it's a good idea to have like a set of documents that are assigned to each user or something. You have to orchestrate it in your test so that you don't reuse them. There are multiple patterns that we can use, like sequential access, random access. When you say sequential access, you can say once you use it, you can't use it again. That's how you can handle scenarios like that. Yeah.
Let's say my task recording, I get the prompt to update delivery date, and I hit OK.
Mm-hmm.
One, is that supported? And two, what if I don't get that prompt when I run the test? Will it wait for that prompt or move on with it?
So you can actually put conditions around this code. Like if this form is visible, then do this, or if this control is available, do this, or if this control is not enabled, skip it. Kind of things that they can write. I forgot to rephrase the question. The question is, if there are dialogues that come up and that if they vary when they run the test, how do you handle them? Sorry, I didn't get your question. Can you please repeat it?
So how to do the load testing is like few hundreds, let's say, simultaneous connections.
Few hundreds of users, you mean?
Yeah.
The load test tool, the Visual Studio load test tool. I'll show you in a few minutes. You can actually test any number of users. I think you just need the number of licenses to a particular license to run so many users. But you can run any number of users that you would like. It's up to the resources that you have to handle so many users. Yeah. So we are running out of time. I want to quickly show you what the experience is going to be. If you run this as is, it's going to run in a single user mode. It's going to open up the browser and run the stuff. I'm going to do that. This is the load test file where you pick the test that you want to run. In this case, I'm picking the sales order test. And there is another setting here which in the Solution Explorer, again, this is explained in the blog. There's a deployment section where you want to deploy your certificate and how to install that certificate, other components that are needed if you ever plan to run this on a remote machine. If you want to generate thousands of users of volume, you can't do it on your dev box. You need to have online virtual agents to drive that load. But we enable it in any case. But there is another one. If you see the last line here, this is a setup command. This is a simple batch script you will find in this location. In the setup and cleanup scripts area, if you mention that when you are running, you should mention that when you're running this test on a remote machine. When you do that, it's going to kick in this process before actually starting the test, which will install all the certificates needed and copy all the files there. So for now, I'm going to run this as a local test and see how it's going to look. I will start the test and show a few things. So here, I just mentioned that the number of users that I want to run with. And there are other parameters, other properties there which can control how many tests you want to run or how long you want to run and how many users you want to load. All this can be configured there on the load test file. And there is a blog, or not a blog, it's an MSDN article, I believe, that I have referenced in the presentation in the last slides. You can refer to that later on. So it's right now running with the interface on. This will help you at least validate if your test is running fine. You can run this few times. Sometimes when you asked how to handle when a dialog comes up, or you can actually run this test to see what happens and why is it failing at times. And you can even do this with multiple users. Unfortunately, this failed. But anyway, you saw that. Come up and do the test. Run the scenario. Now, in order to chain this and run with the multi-users and on cloud, there are a few things you need to change. Again, this is explained there in the blog. One thing, you need to have this section here with multiple users, and you need to have these users in the AX instance that you want to run with. And here, there's you can control which browser you want to use. You can even change it to Chrome by enabling this default browser. But for it to work, you need to have the Chrome binary location here. And this is the dispatcher which is sending the request to the browser. Now, if I want to run a large amount of users, loading browser is going to be expensive. So there is another dispatcher which does headless transactions, which means that you will not see the UI, but it is running HTTP requests exactly simulating the same way using the WebDriver that earlier I showed you. That's one change that you need to make. And then there is another change in the code. It's a simple change. Again, this is explained in the blog. So this is the default dispatcher. If you are running single user, you just comment this code and run with this dispatcher. Now this will create use the other dispatcher. The way you instantiate is different. That's why there is 2 lines of code. We can even automate it by having a little method to do this for us. Then in the test settings that we saw earlier, we have to enable that setup script to run on the server. And this is the same setup file that we are adding here in the deployment, the last file. So I just put that file here and apply. And here in the general section, right now this is marked as to run on the local controller. I'm going to run this on the team services, that's Visual Studio Online. Now, I already logged in with my account, and my account has some few minutes that I can use. This is not completely free. You can, with the free account, you can actually try up to 60,000 minutes per month, 60,000 virtual minutes. So you can run smaller tests multiple times, or you can have, if you have multiple users, you can switch the context and run multiple tests. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to wait for this entire run to finish, but because it's going to acquire resources on Visual Studio Online and run it. It's going to take a few minutes just to initialize everything. But at the end, you will see the same summarized report that you could download into your machine and view the results. A few other things. Let me go back to the presentation to show you. So the data expansion tool, search for data expansion tool on AX. You will find it in the system administration. Trace Parser, if you search for Trace Parser in the dev box, you will find it. And this is how it is. You can actually look at the code, call stack, how many times it's called, what's the inclusive, exclusive time, and how much time was spent on the database. This is used for your performance fine-tuning. Performance timer, I'll quickly demo it. Let's say this is your browser window and you are experiencing performance issues. All you have to do is at the end, type in ampersand debug equal to develop and start using your client. It's going to be there, and the cool thing is it'll start showing you the time taken here, and you can even drill into that to see where the time is being spent and what layer, how much time, including what SQL, expensive stuff. It's just a summary, but it will give you some idea if it is something big. Usage profile, the next stage, now you're done with testing, fill in the usage profile, re-evaluate your needs and volumes, request for deploying the production deployment. This gives us, at this stage, if you could engage with us, any of our SA team members will be happy to guide you through what kind of environment will be suitable for you, or what we will review your performance numbers and see what is best for you. And once you are live, look at the LCS monitoring and LCS diagnostics. There is a blog on the net, and there is also a session yesterday. You could watch the video to see how we can use the information there to figure out performance issues and maintain the system performance. So with that, it's almost over now. You want to take over? Let's go to this slide. Yeah. Oh, sorry, the final slide. Yeah.
Anyways, thank you everyone for joining today. I see people filtering in for the next session. Hopefully you found this session valuable. There's a slide at the end of this deck that Kishore has outlined some of the additional resources that he talked about today on where you can find either wiki articles, access to additional blogs, the tool set itself. For any of you that are Dynamics 365 for operations customers or implementation partners working with those customers, you should also have access to a technical talk on performance testing and validation as well. So that is available afterwards, as well as this session is recorded for future reference. Thank you.